The worst thing that ever happened to me happened when I was only 13 years old, but that was back in the 1970s. I can only tell this story anonymously because even though it's really possible all the people involved might be dead, that's not a chance I want to take. I had always been a hiker. I liked being out in nature and doing things of the same like. I actually got reminded of this story because I was watching a movie on Shudder. Although the situation was entirely different, there was an aspect that made me think about this. I really liked being alone in nature. I didn't mind being out all night and sleeping on the ground in my sleeping bag. In fact, if I could, I'd spend several days out in nature all by myself. In the area I grew up in, there was definitely a lot to explore as well. This happened on a fall day, when I happened to have a few days off school added to the weekend. I don't remember exactly why that was, and I suppose it doesn't really matter. I wasn't exactly the biggest guy on school when it came down to it. Having a day off was always something to look forward to in my book. So, when I went hiking on this day, I was really energized. The first day went really well. I got a lot of distance covered and I got to see a lot of things I had never seen before. I came across this nice creek and decided to just follow it for a while. I followed it until I came across a little waterfall, which I thought was really neat. I decided to do a little bit of skinny dipping in the creek, which was a bit odd to me. I didn't have a bathing suit on me though, and I didn't want my clothes to get wet out in the wilderness. Besides, what could it hurt? I was always a bit nervous about being naked though, even when I was all by myself. I just could not pass up the chance to go swimming in a waterfall though. It was one of my best memories that was about to turn into one of my worst experiences ever. Whilst I was out there swimming, suddenly I heard a loud shriek. It was a weird noise I had never heard before, but the sound chilled me to the bone. It didn't sound like any animal that I knew. There were, of course, sounds I had never heard before. I didn't know how a bobcat or a mountain lion sounded, for instance, but I had been told we had both of them in the area. Hearing something I didn't recognize terrified me immediately. Before I could do anything, I could see some movement a bit further up on the hill. I could see several people just cresting over the top. I was frightened. I didn't know what was going on, but the terror I felt took over. Before anyone could see me, I ducked in behind the waterfall. There happened to be a small cave behind it that was just large enough for me to barely fit into. While I was standing there behind the water, I was able to make out what was happening. I was shivering because I had to stand in that chilly water, also out of complete terror of not knowing what was going to happen. Keep in mind that because of the running water, what I could see through the waterfall was not exactly perfect. It was extremely blurry, but I could still make out just a bit. I could see through it that there were at least 4 men, but it seemed to be a 3-on-1 encounter. One man was trying desperately to get away from the other 3. The 3 guys surrounding him were pretty big and looked terrifying through the water. I was breathing heavily. I was worried about my clothes and backpack I had left on the other side of the creek. If those guys noticed it, they would know I was there too. I assumed that whatever they were going to do to this guy, they wouldn't want any witnesses, and I could tell it was not going to be a good thing. The lone man stumbled and yelled as he did. I watched him struggle to get up, and right as he did so, I heard a gun blast. He completely fell down. You know how in movies you shoot someone and they die right away? Yeah, that's not what happened here. The guy was screaming and wailing the worst sounds I've ever heard in my entire life. It was way scarier than any girl screaming in a horror movie. It was a wail of pain, agony, and fear, and it sounded inhuman. Then there was another gunshot, and the wailing and shrieking suddenly stopped. I had my mouth covered, doing anything I could not to throw up into the waterfall. I felt sick to my stomach. I felt terrified. I felt my soul drop to my feet. I was absolutely sure that second gunshot had killed that man. I watched in terror as 2 of the men picked up the body. I was shaking. I was so afraid they would spot all of my stuff there. Fortunately, they never got close enough to that side of the creek. It didn't take very long before they all disappeared. I still felt cold and was shivering now. I found I couldn't bring myself to get out of the waterfall at first. I didn't want to expose myself even for a moment, though much time had passed and I was sure now the guys were completely gone. I just couldn't even force myself to move. I stood in that cave for several hours before I finally got the nerve to get out from that cave, put my clothes on, and get out of there. I couldn't run though. I was numb, and it was hard to get my legs to move at all, much less run away. My mind was in a state of terror, and it would not go away. I walked back toward my home in a total fog. It turns out I had been so far away from my house I couldn't do the walk in one evening. I had to make camp. I slept very poorly, needless to say. It was the sleep you feel when you're still awake, and it was terrible. When I did dream, it was not the type of dream you'd want to hear about. When I got home the following day, I went to my dad and told him what happened. I asked him to call the police, but he didn't. We lived way out in the country and this was the 70s. My dad told me there were people out in those hills you did not want to mess with. You didn't call the police on them either, because they wouldn't do anything. He told me the best thing I could do was never tell anyone about it and just get on with my life. He told me if we got the police involved and those people found out, we'd end up just like that guy they killed. Of course, I did tell people, but almost everyone didn't believe me. It was just a few people over a long period of time, but now 50 years later, here I am telling you. This story takes place in Arkansas Hot Springs National Park. My wife and I are avid hikers and decided to take a weekend trip from Texas to Arkansas over Memorial Day weekend. For anyone who hasn't been to Hot Springs, it's a very small town that is centered around bathhouses and its national park. We got into town around 1 p.m. and it was extremely crowded. I'll admit we didn't do that much research before coming to the trip, but that was okay. We figured we'd get up early the next morning and do everything we hadn't been able to do today. We drove around a little bit, and after failing to find a parking spot, we decided to take a quick hike before checking in to our hotel. Typically, we prefer the less traveled trails that offer a bit more challenging terrain, more than the high-traffic areas. We enjoy the solitude of being in nature and going along at our own pace. We start our hike and decide to do a 5-mile loop that would show us some good views and allow us a quick stop at a natural spring to grab some water. Actually, our hike was going pretty great. We did come across a couple of other people along the way, but that was expected given the holiday and time of day as well. About halfway through, we're coming down this steep incline that leads to a small clearing when we see a woman just standing there, looking out into the forest. Initially, we didn't really think anything of this. We did spot some wildlife off the sides of the trail earlier in the hike. If anything, I thought we were going to get run off by whatever animal or bird this lady was staring at so intently. We slowed down just a bit, just in case she was taking a picture or something. As we were about 30 feet away, she backed up to the middle of the trail and was looking down at her phone. I assumed we would just say hello, pass her by, and be on our way. The closer we got, the more detail we could make out of the situation. She was probably in her mid-30s, blonde, and in fairly normal hiking gear. Nothing was unusual about her appearance, but I suddenly got this feeling in my stomach that something was not right about her. As we got within 10 feet of her, she suddenly looked up straight at us and said, "Going down? I'll join you." My wife and I have been lifelong hikers, and in my humble opinion, it's fairly rare for something like this to happen. Nevertheless, I tried to be positive about this situation. This was just a fellow hiker looking for some company on their journey. Might be a good time, you know? This portion of the trail narrowed and became a single track, where you kind of had to be in single file to go through. I went first, my wife second, and this lady third. I was listening in on the conversation and occasionally turning back to make sure everything was going smoothly. At first, it was all pretty normal. Where we're from? Is it our first time in Arkansas? Is it our first time on the trail? Then I started to piece some things together and got a little bit more cautious about how I was answering some of these questions. She started to ask things like where we were staying, what our schedule was. Since we'd booked everything last minute, I honestly wasn't sure, so I answered completely truthfully. Not really sure, we're staying a little bit outside downtown. This didn't seem to satisfy the lady. She started to probe more specifically, asking exactly where we were staying, and starting to get a lot more aggressive as well. At this point, we were coming upon a fork in the trail that took us down to one of the local parks that was pretty high traffic. I tried to speed up without seeming suspicious. Eventually, my wife and I made it out without further issues. When we looked back, we could see the woman stare at us for a few moments before cutting back into the woods off the trail and disappearing. I'm not sure what was going on there or what her intentions were, but I guess you can never let your guard down while out hiking, no matter how rural or suburban the trail may be. Now, let me first say I know a lot of people might not like this story. I've been listening to scary stories for a while, and it seems like the ones people get most riled up about are the ones about bullies. And this just so happens to be a story about bullies on Halloween. I was picked on for as long as I can remember. Never really had too many friends growing up, and not even nerdy friends. I was mostly one of those kids that just kept to myself. I guess that's why I was bullied so much. I always sat in the back of the classroom and never raised my hand or volunteered to do any group work. In fact, I absolutely despised group work. And besides, no one wanted me in their groups anyway. For the most part, I didn't really care about all this. I just liked living in my own world. It did bring a lot of abuse my way though. There was name-calling, which no matter what people tell you is bad and can hurt you quite deeply, and I would occasionally get shoved down. Although the bullies never did go so far as to try and beat me up or start fights with me. When I was around 14 years old, I was still going through this kind of thing. It bothered me a lot more though, because of course, those are the years boys have tons of testosterone in their system, and they get a lot more mean and aggressive. I started to get a lot more teasing, and really came to hate high school gym class. I was shy about changing in the locker room, and that didn't really help my popularity at all. During the fall, it got a lot worse. I was looking forward to Halloween though. For the first time, I was going to have the house all to myself. My parents were going to be going out to a party. I enjoyed being home alone, and it seemed like Halloween would be the perfect day to do it. We didn't get much trick-or-treat traffic in our neighborhood, but I planned to keep the lights out and pretend nobody was home. I had some movies I was going to watch and just have a quiet and alone night. I was at home watching a movie when I heard the strangest noise. It felt like someone was tapping on my living room window. It got my attention at first, but I figured it must just be an animal or something. I didn't really pay that much attention to it. Another time went by and I heard that same noise again. This time it was coming from a different window though. The exact same noise, same number of taps, just a different area. That was really concerning, and I paid more attention to it this time. I looked over out the window though and was not able to see anything. I tried to pay attention to my movie, but it was hard to get back into it. Just as I was beginning to, I once again heard that tapping noise. Except this time, when I looked at the window it was coming from, I saw someone outside. It was just for a split second, but I saw them duck down out of sight. I knew immediately what was going on. I had been bullied enough and it was Halloween, so I knew the kids who bullied me were trying to play a cruel prank on me. Well, I was not going to put up with this. I went and turned on some lights to show that someone was home, and then I decided to go to the door and tell the bullies to get the hell off our property, or I was going to call the police. When I opened the front door though, I was cut off before I could say anything. There was a jack-o'-lantern sitting on the front porch, covered in what I thought was fake blood. It had razor blades sticking out of it all over the place. It was lit and smiling at me. That made the entire thing just that much more terrifying. I took it as a threat. I closed the door and immediately went and called the police. I don't think the bullies expected that because they hadn't left yet and were still trying to torment me. They tried to run off when the police arrived quickly. I guess that was my Halloween treat, seeing the police scare the crap out of those bullies who had scared the crap out of me for so many years. My mother is an intensely devout Catholic and has been since my very early childhood. She's always been extremely active as well, participating in various forms of worship organized by mainstream and not so mainstream Catholic sects. Most of my bizarre memories involve my mother and these activities and people. As a child, I was told the Virgin Mary presented herself to me in a vision. Another time, I was told I was an agent of the devil right in front of a church full of my peers. Needless to say, I am no longer religious. As a child, though, I didn't really have any say in the matter. My mother brought me along to most of her church activities, often against my will. This incident occurred when I was in kindergarten, so when I was around 5 or 6 years old. My mother formed part of the church choir and had weekly practice on a weekday at around 6 p.m. or so. Normally, there would be 1 or 2 other kids my age, and we just played together outside the practice room in the church parking lot. On this particular day, though, no other kids had been brought. This did happen occasionally, but as a little kid, the only playmate I needed was my imagination. The rehearsal had been going on for quite a while now, and I was playing just outside the door. I knew I had to stay close by, and my mom had told me to stay on the sidewalk as well. At this point, a slightly run-down-looking pickup truck pulled right into the lot and strangely parked right in the center, with the driver's side door facing me. The man inside the truck opened his door, and without even getting out, began to speak to me. I think the man was about 30 to 50. It was hard to tell at that age. All adults seem gigantic to a kid, and it's been 20 years since this, so the details of him are a little bit fuzzy. The man started talking to me though. Since he had stopped right in the center of the parking lot, I didn't understand what he was saying. He was some 15 feet away. I assumed he probably wanted to ask for another adult, so I walked close enough that I could start to hear him. "Hey there, are you bored?" he asked, smiling. I started to get a little bit weary at that. I had been taught stranger danger before, so I hung back a bit. Unfortunately, I actually was bored at that point though, so I honestly told him yes. "Well, you want to come home with me and play some games? Your dad told me to come pick you up, so come on." He was smiling and sat back in the driver's seat. He looked relaxed and friendly enough to me. I really wanted to go back to my house and not have to wait here till my mom was done, so his offer sounded quite good. I lived pretty close by, so I really thought maybe my dad had really sent this guy. Something about him was making me nervous though. I walked a bit closer before pausing and asked, "Whose house?" "Well, mine, of course." I ran away. I knew he was lying about my dad. My parents would never let me go to someone else's house. It was a thing I had been scolded for before. I turned and ran into the practice room and clutched my mother tight until it was time to go. To this day, it makes my stomach turn to imagine what could have happened if things played out differently. Had I gotten into that truck, I would have most likely disappeared forever and never been found. That guilt would have destroyed my mother and likely the lives of my older brother and father. I'm so grateful for that alarm that went off in my head and told me to run at that moment. So yesterday, I was at my sister's house with my mom, watching my son and nephews play out in the yard. One of my nephews, Harrison, was picking bark off a tree when I remembered an odd encounter I'd had as a kid. I remember saying, "So weird," out loud, thinking about that encounter. My mom inquired as to what I was talking about, so I told her what happened. When I was a young kid, I liked to hang out at the pine cone forest, which is what the neighborhood kids called a small patch of trees off on the side of the road. I remember I was picking the bark off of one of the trees to pass some time, waiting for my friend Frankie to finish his homework and come out to play with me. Out of nowhere, it seemed, this man walked right up to me. I could smell him before I actually saw him, and he smelled like stale cigarette smoke. I remember being kind of scared when I looked at him. He was not a very old guy, but he had a lazy eye that was clouded over, and his teeth and fingernails were stained yellow. My mom had taught me to be nice to people though, even if they didn't look like me, so I faked a smile and waved hello. "What are you doing?" he asked me. Well, I'm picking the bark off this tree right now." "You really shouldn't do that, you know. It's like picking off the tree's skin. How would you feel if someone picked off your skin?" He grabbed my arm and started to scratch me with his sharp yellow nails. "I don't know." I took my arm back immediately. Just then, Frankie's mom called for me out the door and told me to come wait inside instead. I didn't really think anything of the whole thing at the time. When I told my mom about it, she had this look of, I don't know, guilt maybe? She said that it's probably time I knew the entire story. You see, because I was a kid and so young, she thought I'd forgotten about that whole thing, so she just never brought it up with me. First, you should know that the neighborhood I grew up in was a fairly small, tight-knit community. Everyone knew everyone else there, and there was no reason for an outsider to come unless they knew someone. Anyway, here's what happened with that guy. It turns out Frankie's mom, Sonia, had noticed a white van with no windows parked on the side of the road. How cliché, right? Well, she didn't recognize it, but figured it was either from a visitor or perhaps a neighbor. What she did find odd as the day went on, though, was that the van had been there all morning and afternoon as well. She had been keeping a close eye on it because of this suspiciousness and said she just had a real bad feeling. Her house had this huge window in front facing the pine cone forest, and the van was parked right there next to it. She saw me waiting for Frankie and kept a constant eye on the van while holding the phone just in case. At some point, she saw the man exit the back and leave the doors open, then walk right up to me. As soon as she saw him grab my arm and pinch me, she called the cops right away. That was when she called me to come inside. The cops stopped the guy just outside of my neighborhood. In the back of his van were binoculars, a Polaroid camera, and pictures of me taped all over the walls and ceiling. Me at my school, me at my grandparents' house, me at the bank with my mom. Somehow pictures of me everywhere I had gone. But that's not all. He had a key to a storage unit on him as well. Inside, they found a cabinet of knives. A lot. Paring knives, a butcher's cleaver, a thin flay knife, a melon baller, just various types of all shapes and sizes. There was also a few anatomy books, obstetrical equipment, duct tape, and 10 empty 5-gallon buckets. In the middle of the unit was this old bed, the kind that were used to restrain mental patients, and it had wrist straps and ankle straps as well. The entire inside of that unit was completely covered in plastic wrap. My mom told me that the man was now in a high-security mental institution for the criminally insane, at least last she's heard.